Welcome to Jason Cavness Experience. I'm your host, Jason Cavness. Our guest today is Charlie Cotugno. Charlie, ready to be great today?
Yeah.
Charlie graduated from Adelphi University in 1983 and then made the big move to London, where he spent a year in London working as an actor. He then moved back to NYC in 1984, spent the next 5 years working as an actor, director, and writer. Later on, he took a job at Microsoft as a video teleconferencing engineer and spent the next 20 years at Microsoft working in several capacities to include engineer, product manager, and team manager. He's been working on and off as a professional photographer since 1978. His first gig was photographing the band Queen at the Boston Garden for a small local music magazine. In 2008, he created a project called Stories of Autism, which over the next 10 years documented the lives of families with members of the autism spectrum. In 2014, he was part of the mass layoff of Microsoft and decided to go full-time in the photography business. Charlie, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
So Charlie, softball question first.
Sure.
What do you do for fun?
I like to bicycle, and I like to play music. I made my living as a bass player. Well, part of my living is as a bass player in the 80s and up through the mid-90s. Playing all sorts of clubs and with different bands and touring. And so I like to just kind of sit back and play the bass for a while every once in a while.
So the bicyclist, like, how serious are you? Like, are you on the field like ride 20 miles every weekend, or you just do it once in a blue moon?
Yeah. So it got to a point a few years ago when I was doing between 150 and 250 miles per week. It's just something I started to do when I was about 11 years old, really loved it. I grew up outside of Boston, and I would just take off after school and maybe ride all the way into Harvard Square in rush hour traffic and back. So that was about a 30-mile round trip. And it's just something I've always loved to do. And so I continue that. I'm not doing 150, 250 miles anymore, although I think I will. I may try to start that regimen again really soon. But, just getting on the bike, it's relieves stress, clears my mind, and I like to stay in shape.
So I have to relax your mind and get you focus, all that kind of stuff, and just that's like your meditation, so to speak.
Yeah, it is. It is quite a lot like a meditation. I've got the computer on my bike, so I'm keeping track of my speed, how my cadence, basically how many RPMs with my feet on the pedals. And I'm fairly competitive with myself. And so I'm always trying to do a better job than I did the last time I was out.
So you're like one of those me versus me people.
Yeah. It's kind of something I've been cursed with my entire life.
I'm the same way. Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. And then, so what was your degree at Adelphi University?
My degree was in acting.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was kind of a tough school to get into at the time.
Is that known as like an actor school, like Juilliard is known for arts and stuff, or?
It's not necessarily known for that, but at the time, it was one of the best programs in the country. So you had to audition to get in. And I remember in my freshman year, 50 people were admitted. And by the time I graduated, the class had whittled down to about 18.
Is that actually in New York City or someplace else?
It's right outside of New York City. Okay. It's in Garden City, which is probably about 5 to 10 minutes from the actual border of Queens in New York City.
Is it like a private school, public school?
Yeah, it's a private school, but there's been a lot of good actors have come from that, and a lot of people have done well, in that business. One of my friends was a guy named Jonathan Larson. He's the guy who wrote Rent. And, huge musical, won all sorts of prizes. And John was a really good friend of mine. We would do a lot of writing while we were at school. And even after we graduated from college, we had several bands together and did a lot of writing together. And it's funny, his roommate was a guy named Todd Robinson. And Todd has gone on to direct many Hollywood films. I think he might have even been nominated for an Oscar for a documentary he did. But, other people that I went to school with or that I knew, they're pretty big in the voiceover business. I'll hear them on commercials or television, program promos and things like that. So a lot of good people came out of that school.
So I have to ask, you're from Boston, New York City.
Yeah.
Boston, New York City, they have rivalry, all kind of sports, all kind of everything.
Yeah.
How did that work for you to go from like Boston, New York, like this Boston fuckers here? What are you doing down here?
Yeah. So, it was really interesting. It was really great. I used to go to Yankee Stadium for Red Sox Yankees games. And I remember this one game in particular. I think it was in 1986. Roger Clemens was pitching for the Red Sox. And after the top of the fourth, the Red Sox were ahead. I think it was like 11-0. Oh no, I think it might have been 9-0. And it was kind of raining that evening. And so all the Yankees fans, were yelling for a rain out. When it's a rain out before the fifth inning, or before the completion of the fifth inning, the game doesn't count. And so anyway, in the bottom of the fourth inning, the Yankees came back and scored 11 runs. And then at that point, all the Red Sox fans were yelling for a rain out. And then the top of the fifth, the Red Sox tied it, and there was no scoring again until the 12th inning when the Yankees eventually won. But, it was a lot of fun. And, another time was the 86 World Series when the Red Sox were playing the Mets. And I remember being in my apartment and, being a lifelong Red Sox fan, I know that, it's truly not over till it's over.
That'd be a painful time for you.
Oh man. So so I had some friends over in my apartment in Manhattan. And I remember there were 2 outs, 2 strikes on the last batter. And I had a bottle of champagne, and, these 2 gals who were over was saying, just pop it already. They're going to win. And like, nope, got to wait till the last out. And sure enough, they blew it. The ball went through Bill Buckner's legs. And Game 7, even though the Red Sox were ahead, I remember I had a band practice that night, and it's like, I didn't even care, and the Red Sox ended up losing. So there was always some really good badgering, between friends of mine who were from New York, between Red Sox and Yankees and Celtics, Knicks. So it was a lot of fun.
You ever go see any of the Sox games where they play here in Seattle?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I have. I've seen quite a few. So pretty much every time they come to Seattle, I will go to one of their games.
Nice. So what made you decide to move to London?
It was actually kind of funny. I remember at the beginning of my junior year of college, a bunch of my friends said, hey, we want to go to London at the end of the year. We want to move and, just spend the summer there before our senior year. And I said, great, I'd love to do it. And as it turned out, I was the only one who followed through, saved the money, and actually went. And so my first summer in London, I got there during a transportation strike. So it was really difficult getting around. And I ended up getting a job in a hotel. And the great thing about Europe is that a lot of times, if you get a job at a hotel, they will actually let you live there. They'll have a floor set aside. Of course, they take a little bit more out of your paycheck. But I ended up living in a hotel for a couple months and getting around London. And I was going to Paris, and I spent 2 weeks in Spain. It was great. And then once I got back, I decided that after my senior year, I wanted to go back. And so I went back. I think it was maybe 2 days after my college graduation, and I ended up spending more time there. And I worked in a pub for a long time, but I also worked as an actor, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, Peter, so I was in Europe like a total of 7 years, 2 years like by myself, and I was single, 4.5 years with a family.
Mm-hmm.
Like people in the States realize how great it is in Europe. Like the train go anywhere. Like you be like in Germany, let's go to Amsterdam. It's a 3-hour drive.
Yeah, you just go.
Even better. It's like, and they're like, back in your younger days, like the club don't close at 2 a.m.
Right.
The club like pretty much stay open until someone leaves, right?
Right.
Before it leaves, right?
Until the last person's gone.
Yeah. You got the Oktoberfest. There's always a fest going on. Like people have no idea what great life is over there.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. And I only left because I couldn't get my work visa renewed again. So that was the only reason why I left. Otherwise, I might still be living there. I just loved it so much.
So what was like and you only lived in London?
Yeah, I lived in London, but I traveled all around England and Scotland and France and Spain.
Can you talk about how the London English is different from our English?
Yeah, well, the first thing I learned was that you don't ask for a napkin in a restaurant, because a napkin in England is a sanitary napkin.
Oh,
And so when you ask a waitress or somebody for a napkin, you kind of get this look of horror. And then you quickly learn that what you need to ask for is a serviette, not a napkin. So that was kind of like my first real introduction to the difference in language. But other than that, I mean, other than some terms, like for a car, the hood is a bonnet, the trunk is I forget what they call the trunk. But anyway, other than some general terms, it's really about the same. It's no different, say, than when you have the vernacular of the Northeast and then you go to the Southwest or something like that. Different little differences there, but generally speaking, there really aren't any language problems.
yeah. I remember I was in Germany, right? And one time after the club went to McDonald's, right? And like they gave us the Big Mac, whatever. And like, hey, can we get some ketchup? Yeah. And they said to me, like, this church, like, are you kidding me? Right. We almost had a fight with them in the McDonald's, like, because
Yeah,
they don't want to, like, you said, the free ketchup package, free napkins, they would charge us first.
right.
And we're like, we only charge us because we're, American military people, right? But
Mhm.
no, it's charged everyone, right? So things like that you're used to.
Yeah, so there were things like that. Also, if I think about McDonald's, they would put mustard on their burgers, which nobody does here. Actually, maybe in the Northeast where I grew up in Boston, they may have put mustard on burgers, but there were things like that. And at that time, if you went to the grocery store, you had to pay for a bag. So I mean, now here in the States, there's more of an effort to get people, to pay for a bag or anything. But back then, that was really kind of hard to get used to. And also the grocery stores, they didn't have half of what we have
Oh,
here in America. It's not that they didn't maybe have the products, but they didn't have the same variety of products. So, you might want to buy breakfast cereal, and there might be like, a quarter of an aisle dedicated to it, where, here you go to Safeway and it's the entire aisle, of different cereals. So, you had to get used to that aspect of it. But generally speaking, what they have in Europe is basically the same as we have here.
yeah, I remember me and my family came back from being in Germany, Italy for like 4.5 years. And it was too much. We came here, it was too much. All the options, like man, this is too much.
Yeah.
I can't deal with this. This is
Yeah.
overwhelming.
Yeah. If you're used to it, I can see where coming back is too much. And, I even remember the times I came back and, it's almost like decadence. You can't believe all the options you actually have, and, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that depends on the person. But, at least at that point here in the States, we have many more options for what we want.
So what made you decide to get a degree in acting? Were you always interested in acting as a little kid? How did that come about?
Yeah. So, kind of like moving to London, it started with somebody else's idea, and I went through with it and they didn't. So I remember I was in 8th grade, and I always ran track. I was big into running track and field. And this gal who was in 9th grade had a crush on me and told me that, I should audition for the school play. And I remember asking my parents, hey, do you mind if I audition for the school play? And at first they said, no, you're doing too much. And then, I told them, I'm not going to get in. It's because this girl has a crush on me. And they're like, all right, go ahead and audition for it. And so I auditioned for it and I got in and she didn't. And so I remember I had the smallest part in the play. I think I had like 2 lines, and I was only on once, maybe on stage for about 30 seconds, but I just liked it. And the next year I got the lead in whatever the play was that we were doing. I think might have been like Meet Me in St. Louis
And
or something.
what grade was this again?
That was, so I was in 8th grade, I started, and then in 9th grade, I got it. And then when I got to high school, I actually became part of a touring magic company, which was really interesting. And I was doing the school plays and things like that. And then, we would go into competitions, district competitions with short plays, and we always did well. And I just kind of followed it up. And I had a couple friends that ended up going to Adelphi University, and they encouraged me to audition, which I did. So that's kind of how I got into it, totally by accident, which is like 90% of my life.
So were you like a serious actor, a method actor, comedic actor, or like?
Probably my forte was in comedic acting, but I also did serious roles as well. Method, when you think of method, you think of Daniel Day-Lewis, who maybe, stays in character even, when they're not shooting. I wasn't like that. I was able to turn it on and turn it off. And if I did study one method of acting, it was called the Stanislavski method. And he was a Russian actor and director. And his thing was that you wear yourself out to the point where you have no barriers. So you have nothing blocking yourself and the character. And a lot of that was physical work. So before I go on stage, I do a lot of running, wind sprints, which I remembered from playing football in junior high school. You really try to exhaust yourself to a point where you no longer have any mental barrier. You don't have anything in the way of you relating to the character and delivering your lines. So I was really kind of into that method, and not a lot of people were, and a lot of people thought I was crazy for doing it. A lot of times people would try to save their energy before they got on stage, but I would try to expend just enough where there was nothing in the way of the words I had to say and the character that I had to portray.
Who else, like some actors now, or any time in our lifetime, you think are like really good actors, like top-notch actors?
Geez. I mean, the people who we consider great actors might be people like Tom Hanks, who can do a variety of different things. There's, Jack Nicholson, Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino. When you look at the variety of roles that they've done, they're just amazing. Danny Glover is a really good actor. I remember there was a Broadway play that I saw. I think it might have been either in previews or right before it opened. There was a play called Master Harold and the Boys, 3-character play. It was Danny Glover, an actor named Zakes Mackay, South African actor, and Matthew Broderick. And it was all about this boy who was played by a white boy who was played by Matthew Broderick growing up in South Africa under apartheid. And Danny Glover and Zakes Mackay were kind of the servants in the home, and obviously not equal to everybody else in the home. And it was a whole play about the transformation of their relationship with Matthew Broderick. They were kind of his caretakers, and then there's a conflict, and he basically pulls the race card on them. Well, I'm white, I'm privileged. My name's Harold, and I live in this house, and you work for me. So thus, Master Harold and the Boys. And I just remember the acting from all 3 of those actors just being so amazing, just completely blew me away. Obviously, Danny Glover and Matthew Broderick have a whole lot of fame. Zakes Mackay was primarily a stage actor, but just an amazing talent. And so, when I think back on some just amazing performances that I've seen, it's definitely those 3 actors in that play.
So you're in London. Did you find it easier or harder to find acting jobs as an American?
Harder. Definitely harder. But the one role I did get was a small role in a play where I played an American soldier. And I got a great review in the paper for my American accent. So that was great.
So, and then you also work in the public too, right?
Yeah. That was also an experience.
Can you tell us like one crazy question one crazy story that you tell us about the pub?
Yeah, when I first worked there, I mean, I was used to going to American bars, and you pour a beer, and you might leave a quarter an inch along the top, but everything there is measured. A half pint is a certain amount, and of course, people want a little more in there, and a pint is a certain amount. And when you fill a pint, I didn't realize it at the time, but you fill it to the brim, and there is zero foam. And so I worked in what was known as a public house. And public houses are kind of, they're more the original type of pubs that were in London. Very little hard alcohol. The beer comes out of a pump. It's typically room temperature, the way it used to be. And I remember one of my first days, the pub I worked in was around Fleet Street, which was the newspaper district. And so the truck drivers who dropped off the newspapers, they would finish their morning run. They would show up at 11 o'clock, drink 5 pints generally, and then go out and do the afternoon runs.
So 11 in the morning, 5
Till
beer
2.
lunch.
Till 2. At that point, pubs were open like from 11 to 3, and then again from like 5 to 11 at night. And it all stems back to World War II. And they no longer operate that way. But these newspaper truck drivers would come in, and so I always knew if I saw a newspaper truck, after 3 p.m. and I was walking around, I try to avoid them at any cost. But anyway, I remember one time I poured a pint for this old codger, and maybe there was 1/8 of an inch, and he actually threw the whole pint at me, glass and all. He said, "I ordered an effing pint. I want an effing pint. Pour me another pint." So I learned really quickly that, if I didn't want to get any more beer or glasses thrown at me, that I had to fill it up to the top with no foam.
Yes. And so you said you moved back to the States because of your visa problem, right?
Yeah.
So if you had had the visa, how much longer do you think you would have stayed in London?
At least a couple more years.
Yeah. Having a lot of fun over there?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun, lived in a great flat in a great part of town. Yeah, I definitely would have stayed longer.
And what other places in Europe did you travel to go visit while you were there?
Scotland. So, I went to Edinburgh, all different cities in England. So whether it be Bath or Brighton, Cambridge, I would travel to Paris. Didn't go too much outside of Paris, but I went to Paris several times. Spain, I would go down to the Mediterranean coast. I liked this little town called Fuengirola, which was right outside of Malaga. So I used to go there quite a bit. There was actually a large British community there. So, it was easy to go there and speak to people and communicate. So I would go there. And other parts of Spain, Toledo, Barcelona.
Yeah, Barcelona's a freaking great city.
Yeah, great place. Madrid, Cordoba, all my dad was a Spanish professor and spoke Spanish without an accent. And I remember the summer of 72, he took the whole family there. So I was familiar with all these different parts of Spain that I used to like to visit.
Yeah, I remember like when I was in Europe during the army times, like we go to different places visiting, like doing whatever.
Mhm.
You always tell the British people.
Yep.
I like them some crazy fuckers. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
It was like there's no guessing or okay, that guy's a British dude.
Yeah.
Like there's like.
Yeah, and I remember the summer of 82. The first time I went to London on my own, I went to I went to Spain for a couple of weeks, and the summer of 82 was when the World Cup was being played in Spain. And so, yeah, there were definitely a bunch of British hooligans there, easy to tell them from anybody else.
Yeah, it's very easy to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And so you moved back to New York City to continue your acting career?
Acting and music, yeah.
Okay. So why New York City versus Boston or LA? Because I guess you had roots in New York City and that's all you have to go.
Yeah, I mean, even though I'm from Boston, I spent, 4 years in New York. And so I got to know New York. I got to know how everything worked. There was more opportunity in New York. Of course, there were more people trying, to get that opportunity. But, it was just kind of the place to go. And so that's where I decided that I wanted to kind of set my roots for the time being and, work as a performer, whether it's an actor, director, writer, or musician.
And it's the next 5 years where you're like, kind of like a struggling actor, like getting by, like getting small roles, like doing
getting stage roles, small stage roles. And at one point I got really frustrated with acting because, you can give a great audition, but for some reason, there's something about you that may not be quite right for a role. So you wouldn't get it. Whereas I found in music, it was a lot easier to find a place to play and a place to perform. So it wasn't necessarily, there's something about your personality that isn't right for one of these roles. I could just go out, put a band together, and play any number of places. And so to me, that was actually a little bit more appealing. So, while I was still acting, I wasn't acting as much as I was doing music.
So your interest is more to the music side of your career, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you say you play the bass guitar.
Yeah, bass.
So when did you start with that, and why the bass guitar versus all the other instruments?
So I didn't start playing bass until my senior year of high school. And the reason why I decided to go with bass guitar was I had a lot of friends who played regular guitar and acoustic guitar. And what we used to do is, every 4 or 5 months, we used to write a bunch of music, get a bunch of beer, and just make our own albums of music we had written. And it was all acoustic and vocal, no drums or anything. But, I just thought that to me.
I thought you were going to say no drugs.
Oh, well. Yeah, at that point, it wasn't the drugs. It was more the alcohol. But anyway, I just thought, we could use a bass player, and it would be interesting to learn how to play the bass. And so at the end of my junior year, I bought a really cheap bass guitar and took lessons for a couple months, but ended up teaching myself. And so that's how I decided to get into playing bass.
So random question, like I told you in the pre-talk, I've been like listening to a lot of Led Zeppelin, right?
Yeah.
And I watched this one documentary on them, and I rated like guitarists, right? 1, 2, and 3. So I want you to give me your top 3 guitarists of all time. I see what matches what this person said.
My top 3 guitarists of all time. I think Jimi Hendrix, absolutely, number one. What he did and the way he transformed how to use the guitar was amazing. Eddie Van Halen, amazing guitarist. Now we're talking rock guitarists, not necessarily jazz guitarists, but Eddie Van Halen, the way he kind of moved the art forward. And then after that, I'd say you've got people like Jimmy Page with Led Zeppelin, Brian May of Queen, just so many others that are really great. But when I think about people who really moved the art of guitar playing forward, you've got to look at Jimi Hendrix number 1 and Eddie Van Halen number 2.
Yeah, this list had Jimmy Page 3, Jimi Hendrix 2, and Eric Clapton number 1.
Yeah. Eric Clapton.
But
again.
Me, I don't see how anyone has have Jimi Hendrix number 1.
Yeah.
Like, I don't. So when I saw Jimi Hendrix number 2, like, yeah, this list is fucking shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And Eric Clapton definitely, had a lot of influence. But again, when I think of who really took it and pushed the boundaries, Jimi Hendrix, and then Eddie Van Halen was kind of like the next generation.
And the stuff Jimmy Page did, like he would like do the violin bow on the guitar strings, there's all the different things he would do, like they're so experimental, like just pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I mean there are so many great guitarists, and any list to me, 1 is Jimi Hendrix, 2 is Eddie Van Halen, and everything else, there's a great argument for probably hundreds of different people.
So even Eddie Van Halen is like kind of old school, right? Are they like new guitarists that you would like have potential to break in the top 3?
Anybody else who I think is a really fantastic guitarist really doesn't have a huge name in the business.
Okay.
I think of Reeves Gabrels. So he's a guitarist from Boston. He worked with David Bowie for a long time with Tin Machine. And then he toured with Bowie, and he's been playing with The Cure, I think, since 2012. Just an amazing guitarist. When I look at jazz guitarists, there's Al Di Meola, who comes to mind. He's just a mind-blowing guitarist. He's so good. But I guess maybe it might be because I don't explore pop music so much, in the 2000s, mainly because I find it to be very manufactured.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't talented people doing it, but to me now, popular music is more about the beat, more about, how memorable is
The
it,
packaging,
how packaged it is. You don't see people taking as many chances as you used to. Or if there are people taking chances, really trying to push whatever it is they do in music forward, it's not really coming to the forefront.
And
you really have to search for those people.
And there's definitely not any more trauma songs like Led Zeppelin used to do back in the day.
Right. It's completely changed. What could be popular in the 70s, and even into part of the 80s could never be popular now. It just won't sell.
So the band in New York City, what kind of music do you play? Is it a rock and roll band, or?
I played mostly what would be known, I guess, alternative, post-punk and alternative. So, I mean, the bands I was in, we would play clubs like CBGB, Max's Kansas City, the Limelight, clubs that were known for maybe not necessarily pop music, but a little bit more progressive. And actually progressive may be categorizing it wrong, maybe alternative. So clubs that, you might have find bands like the Ramones, the Talking Heads. Those are the types of clubs I was playing.
And you said it was way easier to find musical gigs versus acting gigs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a club or a small bar would be more likely to book any type of music act that had a following than, say, like a small theater. There were experimental theaters, all over New York. But even still, trying to get into those, it was a little bit more difficult. And I just really wanted to perform. I wanted to be on stage. And I had two different things I could do. And it was easier to do with the music than it was with the acting.
And you say you're doing studio work too. But studio work is like you just like get paid to fill a part in for different bands, or what actually is studio work?
Right. Yeah. And so I did work for people who were putting together musicals. So they were putting demos together, for a musical they were writing, or, somebody needed a bass player on a demo tape that they were putting together for a record company or something like that. The one thing I learned, and it's funny, my son is an up and coming jazz saxophonist and doing really well. And one of the pieces of advice I gave to him was music is all about time. Not only playing on time, but showing up on time, because there are so many musicians and actors who, think that they can show up, whatever time they want. They can be an hour late. They can be 2 hours late. But, what I learned was, people will take a little bit of a step down if they know they can rely on you. And I was a good bass player. I wouldn't consider myself a great bass player. But, I was good enough that, if I showed up on time and people could rely on me, then I would get the job. And I got a lot of jobs because people knew, okay, he can play the music and he's going to be there on time. We're not going to be sitting there wasting money on engineers and studio time because someone didn't show up.
Nice. That's an interesting story. So I saw this on the internet a little while ago. There's a singer named Akon. He's like an R&B singer. He did a song back in the day with Eminem, right? And Akon said, no, he got there at 6 p.m., right? Doing like I said, so when he wants to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like with Eminem, right? Eminem left at 5. What do you mean at 5? Yeah, he works 9 to 5. What do you mean works 9 to 5? No, Eminem works 9 to 5. He did like a job.
Yeah.
So Akon came back the next day, like 9:05. They did music, whatever, like 12 o'clock. Okay, I'll catch you later. What do you mean? Where you going? I'm going to lunch.
Yeah.
I eat lunch from 12 to 1. What are you doing, right?
Yeah.
And then he came back 1 and like worked at 1 to 5. Like, I'm leaving for the DC tomorrow. Akon like, yeah, I'm like, we're right there, right? With a few more hours, have the song done.
Right.
Okay. Akon, what can have the next few hours that can't wait?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I have kids, I have family, I treat this as a job. I suggest you do too. And Akon, like, he changed the whole mentality after that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And everybody has a different way of working, I mean, I've heard of a number of people like that. And then, so many bands, they don't want to start working until 7 p.m. and then, or maybe even 11 p.m. and they'll go until 6 a.m. So everybody has their preferred way of working. Regardless, if you're doing a job for somebody, it is your job to understand when they want you there and to be prepared.
So you also did some audio engineering in your work.
Yeah.
What exactly is that? I think I know what it is, but I just wanted to make sure I know what it is.
Yeah. So it's essentially going into the studio, understanding microphone placement, how to work a soundboard, and basically engineering and recording a musical musical act.
So kind of like I'm gonna say like a baby producer or junior producer or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, producer is a little bit different, but a lot of times when you're an engineer and working, if you're working with people who are just coming up, you end up being their producer. Or a band might think that because you're an engineer, you're a producer. But as an engineer, strictly, your job is to get the sound a band or producer wants reproduced and recorded. And back when I did it, it was on 2-inch tape. Now it's all digital, and I wouldn't know the first place to start with that.
Nice. And so you spent those 5 years in New York City, then you decided to move to LA.
Yeah.
Why the jump to LA?
Oh man. I had a lot of friends who were actors who had moved to LA, and I had always considered, before I get too old, why not try to live in LA? And the impetus to do it was actually a pretty unfortunate event. So St. Patrick's Day in 1989. So if you've lived in New York for any amount of time, you know that the 3 craziest days in New York, or the 3 craziest times, are Halloween night, New Year's Eve, and the night of St. Patrick's Day. Those aren't necessarily celebrations that are for a specific community. You have the Puerto Rican Day Parade, but that's mostly the Puerto Rican community that celebrates it. But with those 3 things, everybody celebrates those days, and so it's really crazy. And so on the evening of St. Patrick's Day in 1989, I remember I had done some engineering throughout the entire day, and I kept the job as a waiter at a small restaurant for 3 nights a week. I always had that, in case the music or the acting went down, I at least had something to make some money. And so on that day, it was a Friday, and I worked all day at a studio recording a few bands, and then I had my waiting job. And then after that, myself and this other guy who worked there, we went out for a beer afterwards. And I lived about maybe a 20-minute walk from where I worked and from where I was, and I would typically walk home. And so I remember walking with this friend of mine, and I lived right by Astor Place, and he would usually take that subway home. So, I wasn't walking home alone. And so this one night we got to 6th Avenue, and there was a hot dog stand, King's Hot Dogs, I think it was. And so we got a hot dog, and he said, tonight I'm going to take the F train home. So I'm just going to walk down 6th Avenue and, get the F train. And I thought, fine. So I'm walking by myself, and I lived in a really nice part of town right off, 8th Street. And so I'm walking down 8th Street, and there's a group of people walking towards me. And normally I would always cross the street. But this night I worked all day, all night. I was really exhausted, and I just thought, I'm not going to cross the street. It's probably people coming out of a movie theater that was right there. And so as they drew closer, I could see it was a gang of skinheads. And so they were taking up most of the sidewalk. And so as they approached, I kind of moved to the inside part of the sidewalk and let them go by. And I started walking, and then I got hit on the back of the head pretty hard. And I turned around, and it was this one guy, and everybody else, probably about 10 of them, they started pulling out sawed-off baseball bats from their jackets. And then they had what I later learned the hard way were socks with pool balls in them. And so this one guy said, "Give me a wallet." And I just knew I was in for it. And I said, "What the fuck did you have to do that for?" And he came at me, and I just punched him in the nose. I may have broken his nose. Blood came out, and I just hit the ground basically in the fetal position. And for what seemed like 10 minutes, but I'm sure it was less than a minute, I was just beaten by their sawed-off baseball bats and their pool balls and socks. And so they kept yelling at me, "Give me a wallet, give me a wallet." And finally I said, "Well, get off me and you can have my wallet." And so they kind of pulled back, and I reached into my pocket and I just threw my wallet, and I had a new leather jacket on. And then someone said, get his jacket. And so the whole thing started all over again. And they managed to get the jacket off me. And then a cab pulled up. And it was, I think, the driver and two gals. They get out, and all the skinheads ran away. And then cops pulled up in a van, and they were almost as bad as the skinheads. They basically picked me up, threw me in the van, and then said, let's find the N-words that did this. And I'm like, no, it was a bunch of skinheads. And my head was spinning. I was barely conscious. And they drove around the village looking for who they thought might have beat me up, and never found them. And then just basically let me off on a corner further away from home than where I lived, not even offering to take me to the hospital or anything. So I got home, or I got back to my apartment. I had to call my roommate because my keys were in my jacket that they took. And it was a really traumatic experience. And so I thought to myself, you know what? Now might be a good time to finish up what I'm doing and move to LA. So I took 6 months, saved my money, finished up a whole bunch of recording projects, and then moved to LA.
And how many times had you been in that neighborhood walking around? A lot.
Oh, it was where I lived. So I mean, every day.
Have you ever seen these people before?
No, I had never seen these people before, but it was where I lived. I walked down that street every single day. It was considered a safe area. But when it's basically a citywide mob mentality.
And what year was this?
This was 89.
Oh, yeah, those are bad years, New York City, right?
Yeah, New York City in the 70s and 80s wasn't necessarily the best. The 70s were really bad, which is when I moved there in 79. And then it started to get better in the 80s and, progressed to the 90s to where, now Times Square is like Disneyland, which wasn't the case back then. But, it was on the upswing, but it still, wasn't necessarily the safest place to live.
So how much physical harm did they do to you?
I probably had a couple cracked ribs and a concussion. I had bruises on my head, bruises on my torso. I didn't end up going to the hospital, but I would say it probably took a few weeks for me to, feel decent.
So I'm guessing after the way the police did, you didn't go follow a police report, nothing like that, or
no. At that point, I felt, what was the point? I had already been treated like shit by the people who picked me up and threw me in a van.
Like no medical help, no first aid, no
nothing. And so, I mean, I knew that I didn't have any displaced bones. I've had broken bones before. And if it was something that was cracked, there was nothing they were going to do for me except say, hey, be careful, And so, why put out the money for an emergency room visit and x-rays when, it would eventually heal.
And were you still able to go to work and like do your student work and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it wasn't easy, but I don't think I missed any work or any gigs. I think within those couple of weeks I definitely played live, and I would move around a lot when I played, but for a few weeks, I was just kind of standing there and making sure I could hit every note.
So all your friends and family in New York City, how many did you tell anyone? Just something you kept to yourself?
I told a number of people. My family was in Boston, and I told my parents, and they were obviously very concerned, and my friends were concerned, but there was definitely some PTSD involved. I was walking around, with a utility knife in my pocket, ready to slip out the blade if anybody, came near me. And the funny part, maybe funny, maybe sad, but I decided at that point that if I was ever leaving any place after 10 p.m., I would take a cab. And so I kept that up for a couple weeks until the cab I was in actually got robbed at gunpoint. Nothing happened to me, but at that point, I'm like, what difference does it make? I might as well just walk, because, being in a cab necessarily wasn't any safer.
So New York City is like the Wild Wild West back then, right? It's just like crime everywhere.
Yeah, it went through that point in the mid 70s where they had to declare bankruptcy, and President Ford wouldn't bail them out. So
it was just at the same time, like when the Bronx was like on fire every night, or
yeah. You didn't want to go to the Bronx. There were definitely parts of it that weren't good. Like I said, I mean, it was a step up from where it was in the mid 70s, but it was still coming out of that, really bad period of, bankruptcy. And, I remember seeing on the news, gang, mob murders that took place like maybe 5 blocks from where I lived. And I lived in a great part of town, right in Greenwich Village. So, yeah, it was an interesting time to live in New York City.
So you took that as a sign to get the hell out of Dodge, so to speak.
Yeah, I kind of always wanted to live in LA, and I had friends there, and I figured, well, you know what? Maybe this is a sign. And so I moved to LA in October of 94. I'm sorry, October of 89 is when I moved.
So you hear all the time people say, New York's a better city, LA is a better city. People who go from New York to LA, I hate LA because, it's so fake, whatever.
Right.
And of course, people from LA like, oh, the weather in New York City. How do you live in this? Why do you walk everywhere? This is ridiculous,
Yeah.
So what is your take on that? What's the pros and cons of living in both cities?
I think about that. There was a band called Missing Persons, and they had a song called Nobody Walks in LA.
I remember that band song. Yeah.
And I remember when I moved to LA, that was the first thing that would come to mind. Nobody walks in LA. And part of it is just the geography. I mean, it's so spread out, so, I mean, that was a difference, between, walking and taking subways and buses in New York. At that point, there were no subways in LA. They were just starting to build their train transit. And the buses the system wasn't as robust as it is in New York or Chicago or any, major metropolitan city. So that was one thing. One of the things I loved about LA over New York was the weather. Obviously, in the winter it would snow in New York and it might look beautiful for an hour, but all
the sludge and the
oh my God,
snow.
You would carry an umbrella and you had to use it like a defense weapon. If a car or a cab went by and they hit a pothole and you could get splashed with all that. And then they didn't necessarily plow the sidewalks very well, so you're kind of walking on this uneven ice during the winter, which actually activates a completely different set of muscles in your legs, so you would become sore. And then they may not clear where you need to cross the street, so there'd be like these little mountains that you'd have to climb over with a path through them. And then the summers in New York, you'd have some great days, but then again you might have 90 degrees and 80% humidity, and that's bad enough. And then you go down the subways and it's 20 degrees hotter, so that I didn't miss. To me, the weather in LA was a lot.
New York
nicer.
City like Seattle? Like most people in Seattle have air conditioning. Most people in New York City not have air conditioning.
Yeah, the older buildings, they will not have air conditioning as much as they need it. I was lucky, I lived in a what was considered a luxury high rise, and my roommate got in because it was the model apartment that they were finally putting up for rent, and there was rent control. So our rent was relatively low compared to the same unit in the same building. We had a doorman and all that kind of stuff. But, LA was definitely different. So that much I liked. The culture is, it's a little, it's definitely more about the gloss, it's more about the persona that you put on. It's more about the persona of your business than it is in New York. New York is definitely, what you see is what you get. LA is a bunch of people, for the most part, trying to make themselves look a lot more successful and glamorous than they actually are.
Yeah. I know in LA, I have a cousin that lives in Burbank. I visited a couple of times, right? I never forget the first time I visited her, who was going to go eat breakfast, right? I'm like, is this 4 blocks away? So walk. Look, the look she gave me.
Yeah.
When I said she walked 4 blocks.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I guess we're driving.
Yeah. And I remember
it's 4 blocks. It's like right here.
Yeah. And, I remember in New York, the supermarket might be 10 blocks away. And so, you're carrying all these bags 10 blocks, and in LA, you don't even want to park on the far side of the parking lot. That's too far to walk. The only, and at that point, I don't know if it's much different now, but, as far as downtown LA goes, you didn't want to be there after dark. It was a very dangerous place. And so, if you work downtown, and I had friends who did work downtown, then, you might do some walking, but it's a much smaller consolidated downtown than say like, Manhattan or anything like that.
one more time I was over visit in October, right? It's like we was outside and like eating breakfast somewhere. And it's like 60 degrees, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm from Seattle, like so I have shorts on, shirt or whatever.
Mhm.
These jokers have like scarves on,
Oh yeah.
jackets, like what in the world? Like 60 degrees. Like,
Yeah.
sun's out, I'm like burning up with the
Yeah.
shorts on,
Yeah.
right? These jokers got scarves and stuff on. Like, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah. It was funny because, it might be 55 degrees out at night and there are women with their fur coats on. It was like almost any excuse to take it out. But, I mean, you adjust to your climate. And so that does, 50 degrees up there seems like 20 degrees, here in Seattle. Mm-hmm.
And so what was the reason you moved to LA besides the attack? Like you wanted to for your acting career, music career?
Yeah,
just like
music.
A full-time job?
Yeah, post-production. And so, I had been working as an audio engineer and I thought that, there would be more opportunities in post-production. A lot of post-production houses out in LA. So whether it was for, commercial, voiceover, movies, television, there was more opportunity for
Now
that.
you already done this stuff like 5 years in New York City. So do you already have like kind of a reputation with your LA, or you had to like start all over?
No, it was essentially starting all over. And my timing was horrible because at that time, a lot of post-production houses were moving their work out of town because it was cheaper. So, whether it was in Vancouver or somewhere in North Carolina, they could get the work done a little, more within their budgets. They could save money. It was less expensive. And so it was probably about 5 months before I found a job working in audio. And it wasn't a typical audio job. It was audio for satellite communications. So it was working with a lot of radio networks. It was working with a lot of I guess you could say a lot of radio stations use canned music. And so those services would come into our facility and then we would pass that on via satellite. When I first started, it was via satellite. And so it was a different side of audio. Wasn't the kind of audio that I was used to where, you're in a studio and you're working a board and putting effects on. It was really routing audio for satellite communications. And so our clients included every single Major League Baseball team, all the NHL teams, all the NFL teams, all the NBA teams. We were getting their signals from the venues where they were playing over to their radio station. So, for instance, Seattle, the Mariners, they were on Cairo at the time. So if they were playing, say, in Texas, the Texas Rangers, we took their audio signal from the booth down to the DMARC in the stadiums and then out over telephone lines to a satellite uplink. And then, we would make sure the satellite uplink was working and they would downlink at Cairo. And then from Cairo, they would distribute to all their affiliates around the Northwest or wherever. And so we were responsible for all of those links. And we did the same thing for a lot of music networks. For instance, when Pink Floyd did The Wall in Berlin, after the wall came down, we took care of that, getting their signal to be distributed throughout the country. Motor Racing Network, who thought, that they would be a good thing on radio, but it's actually huge. And I remember when I can
imagine all the sounds of engines racing and all kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it was amazing. I remember when they decided to go to a stereo feed, so you could hear a car go from one speaker to the next. We had to upgrade their feed. And then after a while, we partnered with a company out of Cleveland called Telos. And what they did was they had a box, and instead of using satellite, we would use ISDN lines, which were the precursor to DSL. And then so what we could do was mux up to 6 ISDN lines together, and we would have full spectrum audio, 20 hertz to 20K, which is the range of human hearing. And the advantage to that was satellite time is expensive. It's not always available, and it can be weather dependent. So say, especially in the higher frequencies, if you get a lot of rain, then it could degrade the signal. Or, There might be someone in North Dakota and there's a lot of snow in their antenna. Well, they'd have a hard time receiving the satellite signal. So what ISDN did was it was all landline. There was no delay because with satellite, without getting too technical, most of the communication satellites are in a geosynchronous orbit 23,300 miles above the Earth, and there's about a quarter-second delay. And so with ISDN, it's all over telephone lines, there was no delay. And that was especially advantageous for recording studios. So in our network, we had Abbey Road Studio in London. And if there was somebody there who needed to lay down a track, say, I don't know, Ron Rose Studios in Detroit, there was no delay. And it sounded like they were in the next room. And so that technology, satellite technology is still used, but for many different areas, the move to ISDN was huge. It was money saving, it was time saving, and there were a lot of advantages to it.
So this time frame, you're like in your early 30s?
Yeah.
So I have to ask, well, your parents just sound like Charlie, like you're in late, early 30s, like, are you ever going to a real job? What are you doing with your life? Or how that go about?
No, without getting into too many details, growing up under my parents was not an easy thing. However, they were, despite all that, they were very supportive in whatever it is, that we wanted to do. So they were very supportive. And, I think at that time they saw that I was kind of carving out a niche in the music and audio world. And so they were very supportive of it.
But you're different, not the traditional, 9-to-5 job person. You're like experimenting, trying new things out,
Right. Yeah, I had a lot of different interests, and those were the things I wanted to pursue.
So your time in LA ended in 1994, right?
Yeah.
And you finally decided to grow up and get married.
Well, I wouldn't know if I decided to grow up, and that's still rather debatable. But yeah, so after I went through that kind of brutal experience in New York, I decided I wanted to get away for a week. And so I visited a friend of mine in LA, some friends of mine's there, and stayed with them. And it was opening weekend of the baseball season for the Dodgers, and they had an extra ticket. So they had some friends going, and I went, and there was a gal who went with them who I met and stayed in touch with, and she was the gal I eventually married 4.5 years later.
Nice. Like I talked about this in my last podcast, like people don't really understand like decision points, right? Like suppose you decided, yeah, I'm tired, I'm gonna sleep, I'm gonna go to the baseball game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all these like decision points that like dramatically change your life, right? And you don't realize it,
Yeah,
right?
I think about that all the time. I mean, if I was walking down that street and I saw those people coming and I did what I usually did, which was cross the street, I never would have been attacked. I never would have taken a week to go to LA, never would have met my wife.
I didn't think about that. But that's a great point,
Yeah.
Who would have guessed you get an ass kicking with the love of your life?
Exactly. And who knows, maybe I'll get an ass kicking on my way out of here and, decide to play the lottery at a certain time and hit it. I mean, yeah, we go through life day to day, and most of it, we can take for granted,
Mm-hmm.
but you just never know when some minor decision that you make is going to have such an impact on your life.
Someone decides, lives in further away, they decide not to go to work today, and that cascades a series of events that affects someone else, right? That does something else, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many movies that are about going back in time and fixing this and fixing that, and they're fun to watch. But when you take that same concept and apply it to your own life, you can think of maybe one very minor decision that you made that severely altered the outcome of your life.
I mean, you went to a networking event, met someone you never met before, and then like 6 months later, oh, Jason, or meet this person, do this, like you just have no clue, right?
Yeah. So
I mean, you have to put yourself out there.
Yeah, you have to put yourself out there. And, as much as there's a possibility of something good happening, there's the same amount of possibility of something bad happening. And, you just try to stay positive and look for the good stuff.
Yeah. So in 1994, you decided to grow up again and get a job at Microsoft. So first talk about of course, Microsoft wasn't really Microsoft like it is then back then. It was like,
Right.
it's like a growing corporation. Like it was like on the up. Like there had to be a culture shock, pretty much walking on your own, like do what you want to do
Yeah.
to do so what it was. I say maybe not as bureaucratic as now, but up and coming bureaucratic, very
Yeah.
famous corporation.
It was really interesting. And so the reason why I got the job at Microsoft was my wife is originally from Seattle, and that really didn't have a whole lot to do with why we moved to Seattle. But the company I was working for, doing all that audio and satellite and ISDN work for in LA, they were a publicly traded company, and they got caught for insider trading. And so their stock was going down, the business was going down, and my wife was pregnant with our daughter at the time, and I didn't know what the future held. And so a cousin of my wife's worked at Microsoft, and they were talking, and her cousin said, you know, there's a job here at Microsoft that Charlie might be good for. It's in video teleconferencing, and they use ISDN technology. This is before the internet. And so my wife spoke to me about it, and I'm like, not a chance. I do not want to move to Seattle. I love it here in LA. I love the weather. You know, being able to ride my motorcycle in January through the Santa Monica Mountains, you know, or up to Santa Barbara. I love doing all that. But, you know, her and her cousin kind of pushed me into doing this interview. So I remember doing a phone interview and thinking, great, you know, I'll never hear from these people again. Well, I heard from them again, and it was a video teleconferencing interview from the Microsoft sales office in Santa Monica. And I remember going to that, and one of the interviewers asking me a question, and he really challenged my answer. And I thought, great, they'll never hire me. And then I get a phone call. We want you to come up to Seattle to interview. And I think I did 6 interviews in one day, and I get hired. And so they moved us up, and we ended up moving up here in my wife's 9th month of pregnancy. But I remember the biggest part of it I remember was, to me, it was like going to college. You know, the whole campus atmosphere, the way you did the work, the way you went to meetings, what you did in meetings. To me, it was like going to college again. So it was really kind of interesting. And, you know, at that time in the mid 90s, if you had an idea of something you wanted to try at Microsoft, a new way of doing something, the answer was go for it. Just do it. Let us know how it works out. And then, you know, as my 20 years progressed, you know, that became less and less the case, which is understandable, because as a company grows, you can't have everybody going off and just trying whatever they want. But yeah, it definitely became more bureaucratic and less enjoyable as the years went on.
Yes. So going back to 1978, with all the stuff you're doing, you know, the musician stuff, actor stuff, moving around, whatever, you started taking a photography too.
Yeah.
And then, like, I don't know if it's just a lucky break in your part or a decision point, but your first client was the rock band Queen.
Yeah.
How'd that come about?
Somebody, I had been taking just band shots for free in all the clubs around Boston. At that time, the drinking age was 18. And even though I was 16 and 17, I would get in. And so I would meet a few people. And Queen wasn't the actual client. The actual client was a magazine. And I knew this guy who was, you know, photographing a lot of different bands. And he called me one afternoon at my parents' house and just said, hey, you know, I'm supposed to be, at first he didn't say who it was. He said, I'm supposed to be photographing a band tonight. And something came up and I can't make it. And my editor said I had to find someone to replace me. So are you free tonight to go into Boston and photograph a band? And I said, well, okay, let me ask my parents if I can use the car. And, you know, I said, fine, you know, how much does it pay? And I think it was like $50 or something, which back then was, you know, it's like $150 or $200 now. And so I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. You know, so where do I have to go? And he said, well, you know, the concert starts at 8, but you need to get there at 7. And it's at Boston Garden. Boston Garden, who's, you know, okay, you know, what's going on at Boston Garden? Who's playing? He said, well, Queen is playing. And, you know, at that point, you know, Bohemian Rhapsody had already hit. This was a couple albums after. I think it was their jazz album or something. And he said, so I I need you to photograph Queen. And I'm like, okay. And my camera at the time was a Pentax K1000, which was the most basic camera you could ever find, totally manual. There wasn't even autofocus in those days. And the lens I got from an ad out of the back of a Rolling Stone magazine for $27. So it was this crappy lens, crappy camera. I'd photograph bands, but never in an arena environment. And so it was like, well, you know, thrown into the fire, let's give it a go. And so, yeah, I photographed the band, and I think I kind of pissed off the editor of the magazine because I didn't give him the film right away. I wanted it developed and I wanted to keep it. I remember shooting slides. And so I remember the next day him getting, calling me, and I'm like, well, no, I brought it to, the department store to get developed. It's going to be a couple days. It's like, well, I have to go to press and, however much time. I said, don't worry, you'll get your photos. And so I had 2 copies. I had the actual slides made from the film, and I had them make duplicates, which were like a generation down. And I gave him the duplicates. I wanted to keep the real ones. And so, yeah, that's how that was my first professional photography experience.
Were you able to interact with anyone in the band itself? No. Okay.
No interaction whatsoever. Okay. But interestingly, I ended up photographing Queen, I think 2 more times. The last time I photographed them was at Madison Square Garden. I think it was their tour for the game. And although, I didn't meet the band, but I remembered Brian May, the guitarist, during his solo, I was standing up to take his photo, and not a lot of other people were standing up, and he saw me standing up to take his photo, and he came right to the front of the stage, held his guitar up, continued with his solo, allowed me to take his photo.
Nice.
And when he saw me put my camera down, then he kind of kept playing with his left hand, hammering, and waved to me with his right hand. And I'm like, that's the photo I would have loved to have had.
That would have been cool right there.
And he, and he continued on with his guitar solo. So, that's like, a little bit of communication, artistic communication, if you will, that I had with the band. But, I also photographed them in Providence, Rhode Island, and I think it was on that same tour. And then I think a few months, maybe a month and a half later, when they're at Madison Square Garden, I photographed them there as well.
So you started messing around with photography in 78. You actually started your business in 99.
Yeah.
So in those 21 years, like, just a few questions, like, will you just spend that time like to hone your craft more? Were you like, man, I'm not good enough to be a photographer yet? Like, why so long? That's 20 years. That's a pretty big gap.
Yeah, it is a huge gap. And it wasn't so much I was thinking I want to hone my craft or anything like that. I was still taking photos. And even within that time, my apartment was broken into and my camera and lenses were stolen. And so I even went a couple of years without a camera. But it was more, I was concentrating on my music and acting career. And, I would take photos of friends' bands, or if I was going to CBGB one night, I would just take my camera and take photos of bands and let them know. I wasn't really getting paid for it. Or, I'd be walking around Manhattan and take photos, or, other friends of mine who are actors, I would take their headshots for them. It was one of those things where people said, oh, you're really good at it. And I'm like, oh, okay. If you asked me to reproduce what I was doing, I probably couldn't do it. But yeah, then it was finally, I think, spring of 94 where I decided I'm going to learn this and I'm going to do it. And so that's when I started to take it seriously.
So in 99, you're doing the photography business. I'm presuming you're doing it full time, but then your son got diagnosed with something. Was another decision point where you decided, no, I can't leave my Microsoft job yet? So you were doing your Microsoft job, photography, and then talk about going up with your son.
Yeah. And so when I got hired at Microsoft in late 94, the original plan was I'm going to work 5 years. During that 5 years, I'm going to build my photography business. And in 1999, I'm going to leave Microsoft and launch my business. So everything was on track to do that. My daughter was born in late 94. She was growing up. Everything was going well. And my son was born in 98, late 98. And something wasn't quite right that eventually led to a diagnosis of autism. And so that kind of put my plans on hold as far as going full-time into photography. I still have my business, but Microsoft had amazing benefits and one of the most progressive autism benefits at the time. And so, what was I going to do? I decided, well,
Yeah, I mean, you really had no choice.
yeah, at that point, no choice. And so I stayed at Microsoft. And so during those years, especially his younger years, his first 6 or 7 years, we had access to all sorts of therapies that were completely paid for. And so, my wife was, almost 5 days a week, sometimes twice a week, driving him to different therapies to, kind of help him get along. And I like to say they worked because he became a regular pain in the ass teenager. But it was definitely worth it, and it made him what he is today. So it was important that I stayed. As much as I grew to despise my job at Microsoft, I knew that it was worth doing just to give him and my daughter as well. She needed medical things, we all do. So it was in the best interest of everybody in the family to stay at Microsoft for a while.
So I hate to use the word dummies 101, but give us like a dummies 101, what actually is autism? But people they hear the word all the time.
Yeah.
What actually is it?
It's such a wide spectrum. People can be mildly affected. People can be quite significantly affected to where they can't function without a 24-hour aid. And I know there's a medical definition for it, but if I had to put my own definition for it, it is a way of perceiving your world, maybe even your own existence, in a way that is not in tune with how the rest of the world perceives.
So your wavelength is that kind of off versus everyone else?
It can, yeah. I guess that's another way of putting it. It's maybe you could talk about it as a filter. Communication. You're maybe in a very impacted diagnosis. Communication is very difficult. You're not able to communicate in a quote normal way. Typical, I guess, is a better way of putting it. You're not able to communicate in a typical way, and you don't see things in a typical way. When you meet someone with autism who's severely affected, it doesn't mean they don't understand what you're saying. It doesn't mean they can't process what you're saying, but it may mean that they can't react to you in a typical way. They can't get words out. They can't process a way to communicate in a language, a spoken language that we're all familiar with. Some of the people that you may think are so severely affected by autism, and they can understand everything you're saying and doing and completely process it, but they can't necessarily express it. So that's one extreme. The other extreme, when I was going to school, late 60s, early 70s in elementary school, they were the quote weird kids, the kids who didn't quite fit in. They maybe saw things in a different way, perceived things in a different way. I know with my son, speech was delayed. And, I can't even explain how lucky we are as a family that my son, progressed the way he did. But, for a long time, we thought he'd be living with us for the rest of our lives. And who knows, what his situation would have been after that. But, as he developed speech, just the way he would communicate with us seemed, a little weird or a little off. We'd go to a park and he might go up to a bunch of kids and say, "Hi, my name is Jackson, Jackson. That's my sister Miranda. That's my dad. He works at Microsoft. He has no hair." And so, just the thought process of how you communicate and what you think is important information to you, you might try to relay to somebody else, when to anybody else it's not any information of importance. I'm sure the kids were saying, "Yeah, fuck you, kid, just push me on the swing," but yeah, it's definitely something that takes getting used to. But once you're used to, understanding what autism is, what it involves, then you can actually start to relate and communicate with people on the spectrum.
So once you get autism, that you have it for life, is there any kind of cure, or does medication take care of it, or?
People can progress, and obviously my son did.
Is there a chance that someone like your son can regress and go back, so to speak?
I imagine there might be. I would think that would be more in a case where someone makes some progress, not total progress, but then falls back. As far as a cause goes, there's so many different ideas and thoughts of what may cause it. I know one of the theories has been vaccinations, because there's mercury in vaccinations. So that's why there was a huge spike in diagnosis, when in actuality, the way it was diagnosed was changed, and then you saw a spike, as far as what was considered autism. But on the other hand, people can get better. Maybe not 100% better. Maybe they're able to live on their own. Maybe they're able to live in a group home and function and take on a job. Or, maybe, they were the weird kid in school, but, they got through college. They're very well educated. They can work at places like Amazon and Microsoft. They still might be that person. Well, they're a little strange, but they know what they're doing, and we can get along with them. So again, it's a very wide spectrum. I know one of the potential causes we had heard about was lack of oxygen at birth. And when my son was born, the cord was wrapped around his neck and he wasn't breathing. And they had to, what the nurses called, jumpstart him. I couldn't cut the cord. They had to take him over to a special table, rub him, bang on his chest, and get him going. Now, whether that had anything to do with it or not, I have no idea. And probably nobody does. But as far as cause and cure, nobody really knows.
Does genetics have anything to do with it?
It may or it may not.
Okay. So, and how old was your son when you got diagnosed?
Sorry?
How old was your son when you got diagnosed?
So at that point, people were hesitant to diagnose before 3 years old.
Okay.
We knew he had it, but back then, in the late 90s, early 2000s, doctors would not diagnose it before the third birthday.
Okay, so they are 3 years old?
Yeah, but we knew. It was no surprise to us.
So let's say someone comes to you and their son's 3 years old or daughter's 3 years old,
yeah,
and the doctor just gave them this diagnosis,
mm-hmm.
and they're coming to you for advice. What advice would you give these parents?
Well, number one, get them as much therapy as you possibly can, from gross motor skills to social skills. And I know that's not always easy because a lot of insurances don't pay for it, but, really, really go with your gut. Typically parents know what's best for their kids. And I would also say, don't be afraid to push them a little bit beyond their comfort level. I think a lot of times when you have a kid and, they may object to something or not want to do something, as parents, sometimes you don't want to hurt your kid. And I'm not saying hurt your kid, but I can think of instances in our lives with our son where there were some areas where maybe we should have pushed him a little bit further, and he might be a little bit better off for it today. Those happen to be in the areas of eating. Sensory integration disorder is a big part of autism. So, a lot of times you see kids with autism with, big headphones on, which are really, tampering down sound because they're very sensitive to sound. With my son, he had what they called sensory integration disorder with oral tactile defenses, which means he was very sensitive to textures in his mouth. And so it's really the last vestige of the autism that he has, and which was our first clue that something was wrong. But, he's very, very particular about what he will eat and won't eat, because he's become accustomed to certain textures of food that he likes and doesn't like. And perhaps if, we had pushed him maybe a little bit harder in a few areas, maybe it wouldn't be such an issue for him today.
Okay. In 2008, you started your art stories, Autism project. Was this the book you wrote, or this is something totally different?
It ended up being a book But it started out as a small project. I was living in Woodinville at the time, and I decided I was going to take some images of kids on the autism spectrum and have their parents write a story about what it was like to live with autism. And I told them, I don't want it to be fake. I want it to be real. If you're angry, tell me you're angry. If you're happy, tell me you're happy. It can be general, or it can be about a very specific situation. So I did about 10 of them. I hung them up in a Starbucks in Woodinville. Figured that was the end of it. And started getting a lot of phone calls about people who wanted to be part of it. So after a couple of years, it ended up being over about 50 people. And I decided to turn it into a nonprofit organization, and ended up getting about 250 photographers from around the country to go out in their communities and do the same thing. And we had exhibits all around the country, and an online gallery. So we ended up with probably about 500 portraits and stories.
Can you still see this online somewhere?
I took the site down because when I originally did it, it was built on Flash. And around 2018, Flash was no longer supported. And I did not want to rebuild a 500-page website. So,
is there any way you can build it back?
Well,
it has to be somewhere on storage.
So what I encouraged all the photographers to do was to put it up on their own websites. And on my website, under my About section, there's a page for stories of autism, and it has a number of the images and stories that I created on there.
Okay. And you wrote a book also, didn't you?
I basically turned it into a book.
Okay.
So, it was a publish on demand, and it was it had a forward, and it had a lot of the images and a lot of the stories in there as well.
Okay. So next, go back to your son. So your son, his name's Jackson, right?
Yeah.
He's actually become a very accomplished jazz saxophonist, correct?
Yeah.
Can you talk about this, how proud that must be for you for him, like makes his progress, like being, he's pretty well known.
Yeah, he's definitely well known in the Seattle area. He's only 24. He just became interested in the saxophone and in jazz when he was in junior high. And he originally started playing the drums, but then there were so many drummers in the school band, he never got an opportunity to play as much as he wanted to. And then saxophonist dropped out, and he said, he didn't even ask the band director. He showed up with a saxophone one day and said, I want to play saxophone. And the band director was, well, okay, kid, give it a go. And he ended up really taking to it.
Do you think your background in music influenced any kind of way to get involved in music?
It may have. I was always listening to music around the house, all sorts of different artists and styles of music. So he always heard it. And so it may have had an influence on him. I mean, he says, it definitely had a bit of an influence on him. But, as far as actually going out there and playing, I was never a saxophone player. He heard jazz one day and fell in love with it. I think he was in 8th grade, and he just hasn't looked back.
So you spent quite a few years in the business industry doing different things.
Yeah.
What kind of advice have you passed on to us as far as like the actual business part of music?
Yeah, it was pretty much what I said earlier. I said time is the most important thing. Play on time and be on time. And so that's been the basic level of advice. But really, a lot of it comes down to the marketing of what he does. He's a pretty humble guy. He's very well liked. But there have been times I said, hey, you should try to do this and try to do that, get out there a little bit more. Don't be afraid to talk about yourself. And he no longer is. But now it's more like, if he's trying to get a gig, say maybe, in Denver or someplace like that, and he's, trying to contact somebody, a lot of times he'll run by, what he's trying to say by me. And there was a couple summers ago, he was putting together a tour, and I said, okay, well, have you arranged for this? Have you arranged for that? Do you have a contract with contingency? What if you show up and, the owner of the club says, hey, something happened, we're not going to do the show tonight. Well, how are you going to be reimbursed for that? So a lot of it is more on the business side rather than on the artistic side.
I mean, there's a reason there's a saying, starve an artist, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mean, artists tend to get into the business of art because they like the art, not necessarily because they like the business. And I can say the same thing for a lot of photographers. They get in because they like to take photos, and then the reality of having an actual business hits them, and they end up not succeeding.
So with Jackson, is the plan with him? You might know. You might not answer this. Does he plan like do like his own album down the line, or what do you think his plan?
Yeah, and so funny, he's being pressured by the jazz community here in Seattle to do that, and so in another week and a half or so, he's actually debuting a show with all original songs. So he's doing about 12 original songs.
Where's that going to be at?
It's going to be at it's up on Capitol Hill. Begins with a V. Hold on.
Okay.
It's the name of that place. Let me get it out here. It's on the 29th. So it's next Wednesday. And it is Vermilion.
Okay.
Vermilion. It's right next to Cafe Racer up on Capitol Hill.
Nice.
Yeah. So, yeah, he's got a great band put together. I think it's going to be 4 people, some of the best jazz musicians in the city. Yeah, and it's going to be, I think, almost all the songs are going to be his original songs.
Okay, nice. So, talking back to decision points.
Yeah.
In 2014, Microsoft pretty much said, Charlie, it's time for you to go be a photographer full time.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I was the third wave as part of a very large layoff that year. And I was actually, I was hired on Halloween of 1994, and I was laid off on Halloween of 2014, 20 years to the day. And I had been planning to leave about a year later. I was waiting for my wife. She was getting her nursing degree. And, you know, presumably she would get a job and be 6 months into a job, you know, be in a regular routine, and I would leave. And so I toyed with getting another tech job for a while, but the landscape and the way you get a job had changed. You know, back in 94, you handed them a resume. In 2014, by then you had to have all the right keywords, the right key phrases. And, my severance pay was about a year's pay. And I said, forget it. You know, I'm just going to start it right now. And so that's when I started my full-time photography business.
And when you started photography, what kind of photographer were you at the beginning?
So I was doing a lot of portraits, families, seniors, things like that. And so that's how I started. But because of the work I had done with my Stories of Autism project, I started getting commercial jobs for companies that hired people with disabilities. And so I started doing commercial work that way, and then started getting more and more commercial work. And after a couple of years, I decided that I really wanted to concentrate more on commercial photography.
So how do you say your eclectic background, you know, musician, actor, other things you did, prepare to be an entrepreneur?
Even though I was doing those things, it was kind of like being in business for myself. And then during my time at Microsoft, I ran a team of people that had a very specific skill set that nobody else had. And so that was like running my own business. And so, you know, the main thing is marketing. Without clients, you don't have a business. And so, you know, it's the same thing, you know, when I was auditioning, whether it was musically or for theatrical production, you know, that's kind of like marketing. You have to be ready. You have to be ready to go out there. You have to be ready to get the clients. You have to have a great product. And then you have to put it all together and devise a way of convincing people to do business with you.
I have to guess, even though you started full-time in 2014, and like you just decided one day to be a photographer. I'm sure you were taking you had business from 99 to 2014.
Yeah.
You got to have it wasn't like you were unknown.
Right. Yeah. And so I was developing my business. There were times I might take 3 hours off in the middle of the day at Microsoft and you know, go do a photography job and come back and finish the day. But yeah, I had clients. And so it wasn't like I was just starting cold. So, you know, I did have clients, and I let them all know that I was now, full-time into the photography and looking for new clients. And so I had a bit of a running start.
Talk about this, Charlie. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially new ones, they're like, take all the money that comes in, right? Can you talk about your process for like, like not hiring someone because it's not a good fit for you?
Yeah. It's really tempting to just say, hey, I'm going to find someone who can help me out with this or that. And you bring them on, and then you don't know what to do with them. So it's really important that you are able to define your process, document your process, understand your process, understand the cost of that process, find ways that may seem like a cost, but by paying somebody else to do something, you're actually saving money. So there are a lot of different things to consider, before hiring somebody. So just in the past month, I've actually brought on the first person in my business, and they're working, in sales and marketing, and they are, working on straight commission. But it took me that long to really hone in what I was doing. I've had to make a few transitions in my business over the years. But, to get to where I am now, understand it and understand what I have to do and have all those processes written out that, finally, after all these years, I've got someone working with me.
So we talked earlier about, how like, you might be a photographer, just take photos, whatever. Can you talk about the points like, knowing the numbers of your business, like financials, the unit metrics, all those kind of numbers,
Yeah. So you've got to understand, first of all, that your gross isn't your net. Which a lot of people, first start out in business. So, I need to know how much money I'm going to make on a job and what that costs. What's my time cost? What is my time cost to go out and set up if I'm doing something remotely? What does it cost for me to have a retoucher do some work as opposed to doing it myself? And so at the end of a job, although, somebody may be paying me $5,000, how much am I really making on that job? And once, I figure out how much I'm making on that job, I have to know how much of that is going to go to my studio rent, how much of that is going to go to my website people, how much of that is going to go to my SEO people. And then, every month I meet with my SEO people to go over those metrics. How successful are we being? This month I paid you $1,000, but I only got 5 people who called me, from finding me on Google. Why is that? And so where do we need to trim investment in this area and beef up investment in that area? So you've got to be aware of your numbers. You've got to know where everything is going. You've got to be able to set money aside for taxes. So those huge numbers that may be coming in, they may look nice, but when you get down to it, you've got to understand how much of that is really yours and how much is it going to sustain your business.
And so I think another thing too, like a Microsoft, where you get the same pay every week, whatever it could
Yeah.
be. In your business now, you have some months that are better than others.
Yeah.
Probably having the discipline of like not binging when the months are good,
Yeah. Well, that comes with experience, so I know typically when my good months are and when my slower months are. And it's just a matter of being able to say, all right, you essentially need to put yourself on a salary. This is how much I'm going to make, these 2 weeks or this month or this week, and anything else gets put over here. And then, as you're putting all that money over there, you got to figure out, okay, well, this is how much I need to have on hand for the slower months. This is how much I need to have on hand to upgrade equipment or invest in new equipment. So yeah, it's real easy to get that big chunk and say, hey, I'm going to, go to Vegas or whatever. But you got to have the discipline to understand, where the money has to go.
Charlie, how often do you upgrade your equipment or get new equipment?
Every 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's kind of on a cycle. It's mostly with camera bodies, and it's not necessarily the tools. It's knowing how to use the tools. but sometimes tools come along that make it easier. And so that's how I will judge whether or not I need to upgrade something or not.
So year to year, how much does camera tech actually like advance from year to year?
You know, real breakthrough stuff. You might get one company doing it once a year. You know, as far as photography goes, that tends to be more incremental, so that from year to year, you might not notice a whole lot, but maybe 3 or 4 years, you're like, wow, that's really a big difference. Maybe I should make that investment.
So from your point of view, what makes someone like a really good photographer?
Someone who understands light, which is the most important thing. That's what creates a photograph. You know, it kind of depends on what it is they do. But someone who understands their subjects, knows how to capture them, and knows how to capture the best of them. And that could be a landscape, it could be a person, it could be a building. You know, it's just really being able to connect with whatever it is you're photographing it and capturing it at its best.
So I know there's like different types of photography. I think there's black and white, different kinds. What's your favorite kind to do?
Well, it was black and white. I think each has its advantage and disadvantage. I mean, what black and white does is that there's no distractions. You just get right to the subject. You're not distracted by a bright orange here, or maybe a bright red there, or a deep blue at another part of it. It really cuts to the heart of the matter. And so I like that about black and white photography. Color, on the other hand, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the great visual experience with seeing those colors. I've taken photographs that I've converted to black and white that work better as black and white. And other photographs I've tried to convert to black and white, and they need the color. So, you know, it is kind of an apple and oranges type of thing. I do like going back, and I shoot in color simply because you get more information in a digital file with color and then convert to black and white. The capability is there for me to photograph just purely in black and white, but I like to have as much information as I can up front to work with.
Charlie, are more people naturally more photogenic than other people?
No.
So that's a myth you hear sometimes.
Yeah, just about everybody who comes into my studio says, I'm not photogenic. Good luck getting a photo of me. And we usually end up getting a great photo of them. And really what it is capturing them when they're relaxed and engaged. On the other hand, I've had people come in who know they're good looking and think, well, this will be a piece of cake. And I take a photo of them, and I want to run and hide. I'm afraid it's going to jump off the computer screen and attack me. So no, being photogenic to me is, being able to capture someone as their authentic selves.
Cool. So next, 2019, you were diagnosed with something called Meniere's disease.
Meniere's disease.
Like, what is that? I have no clue what that is.
So it's another one of those things where there's no really known cause and no real known cure. Essentially, what happens is your inner ear fills with fluid, and it can cause tinnitus, hearing loss, and vertigo. And you don't know when it's going to hit, and you don't know when it's not.
So this is going to be an ignorant question. What, you can't just go in and get the fluid drained out, or like, no? No,
there is a process when it gets really bad. And by really bad, meaning that I can't stand up and, I'm very nauseous and vomiting, where I can get a cortisone shot directly into my inner ear, and it'll allow the fluid to drain. And I will go through a series of 2 or 3 of those over a week.
Do you know when this is coming on?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Generally speaking, I can figure out when it's going to come along. But as far as, using something that will definitely prevent it from happening, no, there's really nothing. It can be different things for different people. I mean, I know this one guy, and with him, he he stopped drinking caffeine and he never had the problem again. Some doctors will prescribe a diuretic to get fluid out of your body, but that didn't work for me. So it's real hit and miss, and it can go into complete remission. It can just get worse as life goes on. With me, it's I haven't had a really bad episode in a couple of years. I've had some times where I'm feeling all of a sudden feeling a little dizzy, and my hearing, I only have it in one ear. But maybe my hearing is down by 30%, and it might be a series of 8 weeks where my hearing could be anywhere from totally gone down to 50% gone, and then I'll be fine for a few months. So I just really never know when it's going to hit.
So back to your son autism real fast, and you might not know this. Do you have to know what percentage of people have autism?
No.
Okay. So back to what you have right now. When you get diagnosed with this, it made you make some pretty significant changes to how you run your photography business, right?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, so I was doing mostly commercial photography, and I was doing some headshots, but I was doing mostly commercial photography, and there was some big budgets involved. And a couple of years ago, I went back to Boston for 5 days, and every day I was back there, I had a horrific vertigo attack. And I just thought to myself, I can't take this chance with my business. If someone's paid me $5,000 in advance and I've taken most of that to, rent equipment and get this and that ready, and then, this organization or company has done whatever to get people ready, and then the day before comes and I can't travel, what am I going to do? And so I tried to find an area that I thought that if I did have a bad vertigo attack would be least impacted. And so I decided to make headshots the main part of my business.
Now, for your headshots, you only do them in Seattle, or if they pay you enough, you travel to different places.
Yeah, most of everything I do is in the Puget Sound area. I haven't been asked to go anywhere else. I would probably be hesitant to do it just out of self-protection. I don't want to I don't want to show up and not be able to do the job.
Okay. One thing, I think you do a great job using social media, especially LinkedIn, to advertise your services.
Yeah.
Talk about how you got the process of deciding to use LinkedIn, social media, and all those kind of things.
Well, it came with identifying my audience, which I realized was business people or businesses. And LinkedIn is really, to me, the place where, more business people hang out and communicate than, say, like Facebook or anything else.
So from your point of view, who's your perfect customer?
My perfect customer, I have two. As far as an individual goes, it is a person who understands that their headshot can impact their business, and it impacts how people perceive them. And they need images that show them as they are now, and images that will hit their target market. Hold on, sorry.
Okay.
Can we take a break?
Yeah, we're gonna take a break real fast.
Okay, great.
Okay. No worries.
My parking expired,
All right.
and I don't want to get towed.
Okay.
Also, is there a chance I could use the men's room?
Yeah. We're gonna take a break real fast. So we'll get started again as soon as Charlie gets back.
Ah, fuck. Okay.
All right. So those for intermission.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just didn't want my car to get towed.
No worries. So Charlie, next, you already talked about a sum, but you can go like more details, like why you decided to start your business, what you focus on now, what you see the vision for your business too, and also whatever anything you want to go to your website, we can go through too.
Yeah, and so as far as my business goes, so yeah, now I'm primarily headshots. I really like doing them. I like learning about what people do, and learning how what I do can help them become more successful. I think that's the most rewarding part.
I'm presuming you have I know you're pretty good, but you had a lot of repeat business, right?
Yeah. Yes. So, and that's what I'm really working on. And so with individuals, I mean, we're talking repeat business, like typically every couple of years. And so what I'm really focusing on this year, 2022 was the beginning of when I decided to really concentrate on headshots. Got a studio here in Seattle, and I've established a pretty good customer base. But now what I'm doing is I'm really focusing on businesses and organizations.
Does the industry matter or the
No,
size or anything?
not really. The industry really doesn't matter. Real estate is probably the toughest because they really don't give a rat's ass what they look like.
Well, you think you would think they would.
You would think they would, but at the same time, too, they don't want to spend any more than $65 or $75. And that's not my price range. So what I'm working with now are a lot of businesses where I'm able to bring my studio into their place of business, create images of, all the people they need images of, and they're consistent. They look like a team on their website.
I remember you did. You remember this time you did like a little article on LinkedIn one time, and you gave an example of how some photo shoots are so just horrible, like they look like they're in prison or
yeah. I say it looks like a police lineup.
Yeah, that's what it's.
Yeah, because what you'll get, and as a matter of fact, just today I was writing for my next newsletter that's going out. It's so easy to have a great website now. It doesn't have to be a WordPress site. There's GoDaddy and everybody else, have these drag and drop sites that look beautiful. But I'm a firm believer in you're only as good as your weakest link. And many times that's when you go to a web page and you go to the team or about page and you see the photos, and they're usually a bunch of candids. Typically there's one or two vacation photos where maybe somebody's in a canoe with their dog. And what are you really trying to say to your target market? I think what you want to say is that I'm a professional. I take care of details. I'm going to make sure that the way I present myself to you is in a professional manner, created by a professional. And this is what you can expect from me. We live, I like to say now, in a swipe left, swipe right society. We make so many judgments by the first thing we see. And, and a lot of times that's a headshot. It's a profile photo on LinkedIn or wherever.
I heard someone say, they say not to judge a book by the cover,
right?
But then why do books have covers?
Exactly. Right. And, I've known people who are just so great at what they do, and then you look at their profile photo and, it looks like Picasso on a bad day.
Or they took it back in 2013 or something, or
that's the other thing. Or, I might encounter a website where they do all have professional headshots, but they're taken at different times, different photographers, different camera height, different lighting style. So,
or maybe 2015, they had a full beard. Now they don't, or maybe they lost the gain 20, 30 pounds.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's one thing I tell people is you should really have your headshot redone every couple of years. More often if you've, changed something drastically in your physical appearance. So like you said, getting rid of a beard, gaining or losing a certain amount of weight, going from long hair to shaving your head. When you show up looking differently than what people expect, it actually puts them on the defensive.
Yeah. Who are you really? Are you really being authentic? Like, are you putting on a fake persona? Right.
And and it goes back to that fight or flight, that's been programmed into us since we were, multiple cell beings. You're programmed to try to sense something that's out of sorts. And then once you do sense that, you question it. And, when you're doing business and you're dealing with people, and you want to get their business, you need to remove those barriers. And part of that, whether, it's good or bad, it's just a fact. Part of that is how you present yourself physically. And I'm not saying, you have to be good looking. I'm not saying you have to be, overweight, underweight. You got to be accurate, and that's what people want to see.
A headshot is like from your neck up, right?
Yeah, I kind of like say, the third rib down up.
Okay.
Technically that's it. You go to a lot of, photography sites and they say they do headshots, and some of them will be 3/4 shots, and there's no light in the eyes. I mean, the way I look at it is people look at the eyes. That's the first place people look. They want to see the eyes. Those are for confidence. Your mouth is for approachability. And those are two of the most important factors. And if I'm looking at someone and it's a 3/4 shot of them, I really don't get that sense of whether or not, I can trust them or if I feel like they're really professional. But to me, yeah, that headshot is like, 3 ribs down and that's about it. Anything more, well, I tell people it costs more money to take, a photo of more of their body.
Yeah. So in the past, have you had to tell people things like, like you maybe not want to wear, tequila bottle earrings, or maybe you want to rethink wearing a polka dot tie that spins in the middle, or
right.
Maybe we want to think like wearing a corduroy jacket that's obviously from 1977.
Right. Yeah. And so,
and how do you approach that?
So I always try to head that off at the pass. Now, ultimately, it is the subject's decision. But before anybody comes in for a headshot, I send them information, a PDF about, what's good to wear, what you shouldn't wear, and I will say, earth tones or solid colors are the best. Don't wear anything that's too bright, too loud. Don't wear the big dangly earrings or the huge necklaces. I tell them you need to be industry appropriate. So, if you're a finance person, you don't want to show up looking like a dog walker. And if you're a dog walker, you don't want to show up looking like a finance person.
I have to imagine how you do headshots for a cannabis firm be way different from if a cannabis company came in and did headshots.
Yeah, I mean, well, it could be. It depends on their roles. I mean, if they're CEO and they're looking for funding, I want them.
That's a good point. Yeah,
I was
thinking about people that's working the cannabis store, like regular workers.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some companies I do work for where, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, I worked with a woodworking company. They build, staircases, they build fireplace mantles for new homes. And so they wanted me to photograph their team, and these are all guys, they don't want to be in front of a camera, but the thing is, I don't want them in suits and ties.
No,
absolutely not. I want them to look nice, whatever. And by nice, I mean, I want their clothes clean and wrinkle free, with no tears or rips. And that can be a real challenge, especially people who do not want to be in front of a camera. But, before I see a client, before I go to a company, I send them information with tips about hair, clothing, makeup, anything that's going to distract from the face you don't want. Your attention immediately goes to the brightest area of an image, that's followed by an area of great contrast, and then followed by something that breaks a pattern. So for instance, you looking at a photo of someone, the head's got a certain shape and all of a sudden there are these huge earrings. Well, your eye is going to go to those earrings. It's going to take the attention away from the face. You mentioned stripes and patterns, that can do it. A spinning tie or whatever. The only exception, and I put this in everything, is unless it's part of your brand, avoid those things. I mean, if you're a circus clown, then I expect you to have a spinning tie. Most people will expect you to have, a wild outfit. Mm-hmm. But, that goes into, being true to your brand and, being industry appropriate.
Can a photograph make someone look trustworthy when they're not, and vice versa?
Yeah, easily. Yep. We look at photographs through filters. There might be someone, there might be someone who is inherently dishonest and well known for being in trouble with the law. And I could take a photo of them and they could look like the most decent, honest, hardworking person you could ever meet. Now that's provided you didn't, have a preconceived, opinion of them. But yes, you can definitely make people look a lot different than what they are.
I know you do a lot of retouching, sometimes. How does retouching work, and what's the purpose of it?
Yeah. So my philosophy on retouching is leave no trace. I don't want people to look at a retouching job and say, oh, look, you can tell that got retouched or that got changed. My philosophy is I want you to look like the best version of yourself as you are now. So what does that mean? That means I'm not going to totally get rid of every imperfection on your face. Otherwise, you're going to look like a Barbie or Ken doll, right? That we don't want.
Like you're not doing an Instagram filter for anyone.
No. So for instance, if someone smiles in a photo, then naturally, we get a little extra under here. I typically reduce that by about 50%. It's still there. It still looks natural, but it still looks like the same person. They're not going to show up and you're going to say, oh, that looks like them 20 years ago, or, ask them where their son or daughter is, So it's really leave no trace, make people look like the best version of themselves as they are now. Occasionally I do get a client who will say, oh, geez, I thought I'd look a lot younger. If that's what they want, then fine. I explain to them what it is I'm trying to do and how I want them to appear based on what they told me they wanted out of their photographs. And I will say, well, I would recommend against doing this, but if you want me to, I will.
I can't imagine like if I do business with someone and you think they're like 60 years old. I mean, you think they're like 30 because their picture looks like someone like a king walking a cane, right? It's like,
yeah,
like who am I doing business, right? Like,
exactly.
Is that your daughter in the picture? Is this you? Like,
yep, yeah, exactly. And that's the whole thing. I mean, when you're marketing, you're trying to build trust, and authenticity and confidence, and you want to be approachable. And anything you do that is counter to how you're going to show up is going to put those perceptions and that relationship in jeopardy.
But Charlie, if someone wants to get headshots from you, how far advanced are they?
Typically a couple weeks.
Okay.
I mean, it varies.
Oh, actually, I thought it'd be like a longer wait than that, since you're like pretty like well known and stuff.
Well, it's a lot of times people only call a couple weeks in advance, and sometimes I get people calling, say, hey, can we do it tomorrow? And can I have the pictures in 3 days?
I'm sure you have like a rush job package, right?
Yeah. I really don't charge for a rush job.
Okay.
Simply because I work with a couple different retouchers. There are some that work a little more quickly than others. And I've actually, in my pricing, I can afford to do that rush job.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another question for you. I think a lot of startup entrepreneurs and business people in general have a big challenge of knowing what to charge, right?
Yeah.
And like, they always like charge. I think it's saying is like, we're somewhere like, whatever you're charging, try to charge at least 2 or 3 times more.
Mm-hmm.
What was your process of finally figuring out your perfect pricing policy?
It was really, it was an evolution. And I really only, and it'll continue to be an evolution. A lot of it is understanding your market, understanding your value, understanding how you work with people. And a lot of it too comes from the feedback you get from people. If I were to get feedback from someone, and I ask for very honest feedback, and they say, well, you didn't capture this, you didn't capture that. I wish this was different. Yeah, this was good. But I mean, if I had that kind of reaction, then I probably, would say, all right, I've got work to do. And because I've got work to do, I shouldn't be charging X amount of money. It's more like I should be charging this. A lot of it is looking at other people in the market. So looking at, whether it's headshots or whatever, what are other people charging and what does their work look like? And so it's that. And then, it's getting to a point where you feel you've honed your craft to a point where it's reproducible. You have no problem doing it. And then saying, okay, well, now I calculate all my pricing like we spoke about before. How much am I paying in rent? How much am I paying my SEO people? How much am I paying my retouchers? And then figuring out, okay, well then what do I need on top of that? And then hopefully you come up with a figure that allows for all of that, you're not undercutting yourself or, gouging your clients.
So you've been doing photography for a while now. Having said that, do you have any mentors in photography business or in business in general, just photography, right? Any mentors in general?
Yeah, I would say when I decided that I would need to go to doing headshots, and actually it was even a little bit before that, I'd had my eye on a guy named Peter Hurley, who's based out of New York, and he's considered the best headshot photographer in the world. And I remember buying his book and saw a few videos, that he had done on YouTube. And then when the pandemic hit, I thought, well, I lost pretty much 6 months worth of work within a week. And so I thought, well, maybe this is a good time to, reconsider how I do business and what I do for business. And it was right after I get diagnosed with Meniere's disease. And so I thought, well, he has this thing called the Headshot Crew, where he teaches people his methods and how he works with people. And I thought I would just join that and give it a go. And not only did it transform the way I create an image, not only headshots, but other images, but it also transformed the way I think about business and the way I do business. And so he is right now top of my list for mentors. And on top of that, I mean, he's just a really great guy. I don't know if eccentric is the right word to use, but he's definitely got his own personality. He's very out there. He's also a world-class sailor. I believe he was on the Olympic team that went to Australia back, I think in 2000, back to Sydney. And he still competes internationally and finishes in the top 3 in his class. So he's a very talented guy, very funny guy. He's also very straightforward. If you show him a photo and he looks at it, and he mentors to your ability. But, I've had him say to some of my photos, wow, that looks like shit. What were you thinking? And it's like, okay, there's a little bit of a bruise to the ego, but, he doesn't necessarily say it in a mean way, but, he's just really been a huge influence. And I guess back in November, I sent him an email so he was helping me out with one aspect, and I sent him an email, and I actually told him, how much I thought of him and how over the past few years his business, and what he had taught had really influenced me. And then I remember one Saturday morning, I just got a phone call from him, and we were talking about business and where I need to go. So he's not only is he a great mentor towards me, he's just a great guy on top of it.
So Charlie, second part of the question.
Yeah.
Who are you mentoring?
Well, every once in a while, I wouldn't say right now I'm not necessarily actively mentoring someone on a consistent basis, but I will have people get in touch with me who are just starting out in their careers, and they will ask me, well, I'm thinking of going to college and learning this, should I major in photography? I always tell them, no, you should major in business and, keep up the photography. There are places to learn it. But yeah, occasionally I will get some people who want to learn more. And so I will take them out, and on some of my gigs, they can assist, and we will go over lighting. We will go over, how to create a different type of shot, how to relate with people, which I think is 90% of it. There have been some great photographers who are just, quite frankly, complete assholes, and nobody wants to work with them. So I think, being able to develop people skills is incredibly important, especially, I know I do a lot of expression coaching. So, I'm trying to get different expressions, different looks out of people, and they have to trust you. And so I will talk to people about that, and just generally, how to work in the industry, and, to understand that, it's not all about the equipment. It's really about finding your voice and what you do, and being able to create, using that voice.
So Charlie, hypothetical situation.
Yeah.
So that's what you're not hiring, you're doing stuff your own. But there's a photographer out there, you're kind of brand new, inexperienced, and they know math. If I come out and work for Charlie any kind of way, I'll just advance my growth much faster. What would this person have to do to convince you to bring them on? In an internship, or principal, payroll, whatever it might be, what does this person have to do to convince you, like, this person is worth my time to bring him on?
Yeah. More than the talent that they may or may not have. And I've kind of followed this whether I was a Microsoft manager or I was directing a show or anything like that, it's their willingness to absorb information and to put out an honest effort. If someone is open to learning and open to giving 100%, you can teach them anything and they will learn anything. So that, to me, I would rather have someone who knows nothing about photography with a great attitude towards learning it than having someone who is just has amazing potential, does great work, but doesn't want to listen to a thing I say. And not meaning that, what I say is gospel or anything like that, but, they have to be open to feedback. They can disagree with it, which is fine. We can have conversations. That's perfectly fine. But, if someone just shows up and they think they know how to do everything and they're not going to listen to anything I say and they're not going to show up on time and they're not going to act appropriately with a client, then I want nothing to do with them.
Charlie, is there like a dream or bucket list headshot out there, something you want to do, someone famous or maybe not famous, it's like this is like your dream shot?
I always wanted to photograph David Bowie, which obviously now is not a possibility. But it would probably be a musician that I really respect. Love to photograph Peter Gabriel. Like I said, David Bowie was someone I always wanted to photograph. Probably someone in the arts, some kind of artist. They are probably more open to different ideas, different approaches. And, that's one thing with headshot photography. It is pretty much formulaic. But, I do take the opportunities to photograph people in different situations. And people who are artists, singers, musicians, they always seem to be a little bit more open to discovering new interpretations of who they are.
Charlie, is there anything else that you want to talk about or anything I did not ask you that you want to talk about?
No, I mean, really nothing other than, the basic, how do you contact me? And yeah, if you're interested in contacting me for a headshot, or maybe even some personal branding or music photography, it's very simple. My website is ccheadshots.com. And there you can find a lot of information about the different things that I do. I like to work with nonprofits. I really believe in giving back and helping out other people who need a hand.
You do a lot of work with what's called a Shelley's one, redefining.
Yeah, redefining your future.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they do anywhere between 2 or 4 different events each year where they have symposiums for people who are transitioning from military to civilian careers, and they want a LinkedIn shot. And so I will go down to, whatever they're doing and create images for anywhere between 7 and 30 people and do all the retouching on them and give them images to use in their, quest for a new career. And then also every year they create a calendar for a fundraising project. And I typically do all the photos for those as well.
Yes. So Charlie, any last minute wisdom or advice or any subject you want to talk about?
If you're looking to me for that wisdom, you may be looking in the wrong place.
That may be the best wisdom everyone has ever given on this podcast.
There you go. Yeah. I know my limits and limitations.
So Charlie, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a lot of fun. Thanks, Jason.
And to our listeners, thanks for your time as well. And remember to be great every day.